I never imagined that saying yes to a simple favor would end with someone paying me $820 every single month to use a garage they once tried to quietly take from me. And honestly, if you had told me that was how this story would end, I probably would have laughed right in your face. Looking back now, the warning signs were there from the beginning. I just didn't recognize them because I still believed people generally meant what they said. My name is Rachel Carter. I'm 37 years old. I teach history at a public high school outside Cedar Falls, Iowa, and for most of my adult life, my biggest concerns were grading essays, making sure my students stayed awake during Reconstruction, and keeping my late grandfather's old garage standing through another Midwest winter. It wasn't anything special if you looked at it from the street: weathered cedar siding, an old steel roof that rattled every time the wind rolled across the fields, a concrete floor with more stains than I could count, and shelves packed with fishing gear, Christmas decorations, old photo albums, and every tool my grandfather had ever sworn he'd need someday. To me, though, it wasn't just another building. It was one of the last pieces of my family that still felt untouched. My grandparents bought that property back in the early 60s, long before vacation homes and luxury development started creeping into our little town. Every scratch on those walls reminded me of helping Grandpa rebuild lawnmowers or listening to Grandma laugh while she organized canning jars. I wasn't interested in selling it, renting it, or turning it into one of those trendy workshop studios people post online. It was simply home. Then the neighborhood started changing. Wealthy buyers from Chicago and Minneapolis discovered the lake nearby, and within a few years, modest family homes disappeared behind expensive renovations and oversized SUVs. Along with the new money came a much more aggressive homeowners association. It wasn't the kind of HOA that reminded you to mow your lawn. This one seemed determined to remind everyone exactly who held the power. The new president was Vanessa Langford. She couldn't have been more different from the people who had lived there for decades. Perfect clothes, flawless smile, luxury SUV that always looked freshly detailed, and somehow she always managed to speak like she was giving instructions instead of having conversations. The first time we met, she complimented my flower beds, asked about my teaching job, and told me she loved preserving small-town charm. Looking back, I think she practiced sounding friendly the same way lawyers practice closing arguments. A few weeks later, she sent me a text. She explained that contractors were renovating part of her property, and she desperately needed temporary storage for HOA maintenance equipment. Just 1 month, she promised. 4 weeks, maybe a little less if construction stayed on schedule. She even added one of those smiling emojis that somehow made the request feel harmless. I remember sitting in my kitchen reading the message while drinking coffee before school. I actually smiled. Helping someone for a month didn't seem like a big deal. The garage wasn't being used every day anyway, and my grandparents had always taught me that neighbors looked after one another. So I answered with 2 words. Sure, fine. Looking back, those 2 words probably became the most expensive permission she ever received. The first month came and went. Then another. I was buried under lesson plans. Football season started. Parent conferences arrived, and life kept moving faster than I realized. Occasionally, I'd drive past the garage and notice trucks parked outside, or workers loading supplies, but I assumed construction was taking longer than expected. Vanessa always waved whenever she saw me, always smiling, always acting like everything was perfectly normal. Somewhere around the 6th month, I started wondering why nobody had mentioned moving out, but every time I thought about bringing it up, another school event demanded my attention. Then one Saturday morning, I stopped by the property to grab an old toolbox. The moment I unlocked the side door, I froze. My grandfather's old workbench was gone. The shelves had been replaced with heavy-duty industrial storage racks. Bright LED lighting covered the ceiling. A brand-new climate control system hummed quietly in the corner. Expensive cabinets lined one wall. Maintenance equipment, landscaping supplies, paint, chemicals, power tools. Everything was labeled with HOA inventory stickers. It didn't look like my family's garage anymore. It looked like a professional operations center. I just stood there, staring, trying to convince myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe they planned to restore everything afterward. Maybe Vanessa intended to ask permission later. Maybe this had all become one giant misunderstanding. Then, 3 days later, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside was a neatly printed letter thanking me for my generous contribution to improving the community by allowing the HOA to establish its permanent maintenance facility inside what the letter casually described as donated property. I read that sentence 4 times before my brain accepted what my eyes were seeing. Donated. They weren't thanking me for borrowing the space anymore. They had quietly rewritten the entire story. And somehow I was expected to smile while they claimed a piece of my family's history. That was the exact moment something inside me changed, and I decided I wasn't going to argue with Vanessa. I was going to let the paperwork do the talking. I wish I could tell you I immediately called the police or marched into the next HOA meeting waving that letter around. But that's not what happened. Years of teaching teenagers had taught me one thing above everything else. The person who reacts first usually loses. So instead of letting anger make decisions for me, I made coffee, spread every document I owned across my dining room table, and started building a timeline. I found my grandfather's original deed from 1963 tucked inside an old fireproof box. Then the transfer documents after my parents passed the property to me. Tax records going back years. Insurance policies, survey maps, everything. Every single piece of paper pointed to one simple fact. That garage belonged to me. Completely. No easements. No shared use agreement. No HOA ownership. Nothing. Then I scrolled back through my phone until I found Vanessa's original text message. Just 1 month while renovations finish. That was it. No mention of permanent use. No donation. No improvements. Just 1 month. I took screenshots, emailed copies to myself, printed them, and slid them into a folder. By Monday afternoon, I was sitting across from an attorney named Michael Brennan, a quiet man in his late 50s who had represented several local farmers over property disputes. He spent nearly 20 minutes reading without saying a word, occasionally pushing his glasses higher on his nose. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, smiled just a little, and asked, "Did she really install all those upgrades without written permission?" I nodded. Air conditioning, electrical work, shelving, lighting, everything. He actually chuckled. "Rachel, I think your HOA president just bought you a very expensive garage." That wasn't exactly the answer I expected. He explained that under Iowa property law, permanent improvements voluntarily installed on someone else's property without an enforceable agreement generally become part of that property. In other words, Vanessa had spent thousands improving something she didn't own. I remember blinking at him. "So, she can't take any of it back?" He shook his head. "Not without tearing your building apart. And she'd have a difficult time convincing a judge that was reasonable after occupying your property for over a year." For the first time since opening that ridiculous letter, I smiled. Michael wasn't finished. "One more thing," he added. "She also occupied your property for 13 months after her permission expired." That sentence stayed with me the entire drive home. Permission expired. Suddenly, everything looked different. This wasn't just about upgrades anymore. They had been using my building every single day while acting as though I should be grateful. The following Saturday, I drove to the hardware store and bought the best smart keypad lock they carried. I picked one with remote access, activity logs, temporary codes, and backup battery power. The cashier joked that somebody must have been stealing my tools. I smiled and said, something like that. Sunday night I barely slept. I kept wondering if I was overreacting. Maybe I should give Vanessa one last chance. Maybe we could still solve this with a conversation. But every time that thought appeared, I pictured the word donated printed across that letter, and all my doubt disappeared. Monday morning, I arrived just before sunrise. The air still carried that cool smell Iowa gets before summer fully settles in. Birds were barely awake as I removed the old lock and installed the new keypad. It took less than 30 minutes. Then I mounted a professionally printed aluminum sign beside the entrance. Private property. Unauthorized entry subject to civil penalties. Daily occupancy fee, $500. Contact owner before access. I stepped back, looked at it for a few seconds, locked the door, and drove to school. Around 9:15, my phone started vibrating during second period. I silenced it. Then it buzzed again and again. By lunch, I had 19 missed calls. Most came from numbers I didn't recognize. The 20th was Vanessa. I stepped outside into the teacher's parking lot and answered. She didn't even say hello. "Rachel, what exactly do you think you're doing?" Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. I looked across the empty lot before answering. "Teaching American history." "Why?" She ignored the joke. "My maintenance crew can't get into the garage." "That's because it's locked. Our equipment is inside." "Actually," I replied calmly, "my garage contains equipment your organization left inside after occupying my property for 13 months. Silence. Real silence. The kind where you can almost hear someone realizing the conversation isn't going the way they expected. Finally, she said, "This isn't funny." I don't remember laughing. Her tone changed immediately, softer now, controlled. "Rachel, we've invested thousands improving that building. I noticed. You should appreciate everything we've done for your property." I leaned against the brick wall outside school. "Vanessa, appreciation usually follows permission. You skipped that part." Another pause. Then came the threat. "You'll be hearing from our attorney." "I'm counting on it." She hung up first. Michael called me less than an hour later, because apparently her attorney wasted no time sending a demand letter claiming unjust enrichment, interference with HOA operations, and financial damages. Michael read parts of it over the phone before laughing. "They actually wrote this?" he asked. "Apparently." "Good. Send them every document we discussed." That afternoon, he emailed back copies of my deed, the original text message, photographs showing the garage before they moved in, newer photographs showing every unauthorized improvement, county tax records, and one simple letter reminding them that permission had ended 12 months earlier. He copied every HOA board member on the email. That's when things started falling apart for Vanessa. See? Board members are loyal until they realize they might become personally involved in litigation. Suddenly, several people who had ignored my emails for months started calling, politely asking if there had been some misunderstanding. One elderly board member named Harold Jensen even stopped by my house with homemade banana bread, which was honestly the most Midwestern peace offering imaginable. He awkwardly admitted he'd always believed the HOA leased the garage legally. "Vanessa said she worked everything out with you," he confessed. "She told us you donated it because you wanted to support the community." I almost laughed. Does that sound like something a public school teacher living on one income usually does? He rubbed the back of his neck. "Now that you mention it, no." Word spread faster than either of us expected. Small towns have a way of turning quiet conversations into public knowledge before dinner. Local Facebook groups exploded. Some people criticized me for disrupting neighborhood services, but far more questioned why the HOA president thought she could simply take private property because she wanted it. Former residents shared their own stories about fines, intimidation, selective rule enforcement, and Vanessa's habit of treating disagreement as disrespect. Within days, the conversation wasn't really about my garage anymore. It became about power, about whether people with money assumed rules only applied to everyone else. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community clubhouse. I wasn't even required to attend, but Michael suggested I come anyway. Sometimes, he told me while gathering his files, the strongest legal argument is simply showing up prepared. When we walked inside, conversations immediately stopped. Every folding chair was filled. Residents lined the walls. Vanessa sat confidently at the front beside the HOA attorney, wearing another perfectly tailored blazer as though appearance alone could win lawsuits. She barely looked at me. One board member, Gerald Foster, smirked and whispered loudly enough for half the room to hear, "Guess the school teacher thinks she's Perry Mason now." A few people laughed. I didn't respond. Michael simply placed two thick binders on the table. One contained every property document. The other contained every text, email, invoice, photograph, and timeline covering 13 months of unauthorized occupation. He slid both binders toward the board without saying a single dramatic word. Then he looked directly at Vanessa and calmly asked one question. "Could you please provide the written agreement transferring ownership or granting permanent possession of Ms. Carter's garage?" The room became so quiet I could hear the old air conditioner humming above us. And for the first time since this whole nightmare had started, Vanessa didn't seem to have an answer. Vanessa opened her mouth, closed it again, shuffled through a stack of papers, whispered something to her attorney, then looked back at the board with a smile that suddenly didn't look nearly as confident as it had 5 minutes earlier. "The agreement was verbal," she finally said. Michael didn't even blink. "Interesting," he replied, "because the only written communication we have says 1 month." He held up a printed copy of her text message, then slowly placed it on top of the binders. Nobody laughed this time. Gerald, who had mocked me only minutes earlier, shifted uncomfortably in his chair and avoided eye contact. Another board member quietly asked Vanessa whether anyone had actually approved converting my garage into a permanent HOA facility. She hesitated just long enough for everyone to understand the answer before she finally admitted. It seemed like the most practical solution. Practical. That word echoed through the room because everyone knew what she really meant. Practical for her. Practical for the HOA. just not for the person who actually owned the building. The meeting ended without the dramatic shouting matches people probably expected, but the silence that followed was even more satisfying. Sometimes watching someone's confidence slowly collapse is louder than any argument. 2 days later, Michael called me while I was grading quizzes after school. "They're ready to negotiate," he said. I smiled. "Already?" Public pressure works faster than lawsuits. The proposal was exactly what you'd expect. They wanted everything to disappear quietly. No admission of wrongdoing. No public apology. No court filings. Just a financial settlement and access to the garage again. Michael looked at me across his desk. "Your decision." I thought about my grandparents. I thought about every weekend they'd spent maintaining that property. I thought about the letter thanking me for a donation I had never made. "I'm willing to negotiate," I answered. "But only if we're negotiating reality." The final number surprised even me. They agreed to pay 13 months of back rent based on fair commercial storage value, reimburse legal expenses, and acknowledged that every improvement installed inside the garage permanently belonged to me. Between occupancy, legal costs, and other negotiated damages, the settlement climbed well past $20,000. Vanessa signed every page without saying much. I figured that was the end of it. It wasn't. About a week later, Michael called again, sounding amused. "You're not going to believe this. Try me. The HOA wants to lease your garage." I actually laughed out loud. Seriously? Apparently, relocating operations has become a logistical nightmare. Their new storage facility is nearly 20 minutes farther away. Maintenance requests are taking longer, landscaping costs are increasing, residents are complaining, and several board members think moving everything back is cheaper. Life has a strange sense of humor sometimes. The very building they once acted as though they owned had suddenly become something they desperately needed permission to use. This time there were no casual text messages, no assumptions, no smiling emojis. If they wanted my property, they would do it my way. Michael drafted the lease exactly as I requested. $820 every month. 5-year minimum term. Automatic late fees beginning the day after payment was due. Missed 10 consecutive days without curing the default, and the lease could be terminated. Any abandoned equipment after eviction would legally become my property after the required notice period. Maintenance, insurance responsibilities, access hours, inspections. Every detail was written clearly enough that nobody could pretend to misunderstand anything ever again. Vanessa arrived at Michael's office wearing another expensive blazer, but this time she looked tired, really tired. She read every page carefully. Once or twice she started to object before realizing the contract simply required her to respect my property the same way she'd expected everyone else to respect HOA rules. Finally, she set the papers down, picked up the pen, and signed without another word. I signed immediately after her. We shook hands because that's what adults do when business is finished, but there wasn't much warmth in it. Respect? Maybe. Definitely not friendship. These days, the payment arrives like clockwork every month. My property taxes are covered. The garage is better insulated than it has ever been. The upgraded lighting makes it easier whenever I need to organize family belongings, and every improvement they installed remains part of my property. Sometimes, I drive by and see the maintenance crew loading equipment into a building that still legally belongs to me, and I can't help smiling a little. Not because I enjoy seeing someone lose, but because I finally learned that kindness without boundaries isn't generosity. It's an invitation for the wrong person to take advantage of you. People sometimes ask whether I regret saying yes that first day. Honestly, no. If I had refused, I never would have discovered exactly what kind of person Vanessa really was. More importantly, I never would have discovered what I was capable of when someone crossed a line that mattered. She believed money and authority could quietly rewrite ownership. In the end, the only thing she really accomplished was increasing the value of my family's property and turning herself into my most reliable tenant. Now I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have accepted the settlement and lease? Or would you have taken the entire fight all the way through court on principle? Was Vanessa simply overconfident? Or do you think she genuinely believed she had done nothing wrong? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this always seem to divide people right down the middle, and I'd really like to hear which side you're on.